The Gift series is a particularly close one to my heart. The Gift of a Child actually began many, many years ago when my oldest child, who was 4, did for me what little Preston does in this little Christmas story. My son David was 4 at the time, and like the main character Rae, I had been widowed 2 weeks before, I can talk honest. The 2-month anniversary of my first husband's death fell on my birthday, and it was a tough time for me, and it was one that it's hard to explain when you've got 2 children under 4, and my son David had had his birthday the month before. So this tale I originally wrote as a thank you to my newsletter readers, and I provide it to all of them for free. But in the process of telling the story, I fell in love with her neighbor Dylan, who is a fictional character. He wasn't somebody that I dealt with, but I hope you enjoy this and know that it was very much a personal story of my own. Thank you.
The Gift of a Child, written by Donna K. Weaver, narrated by Sandra Parker. To my son David, the real-life Preston. Chapter 1. It was the second worst day of Rae Cavanaugh's life. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. It'd been 2 months to the day since the men from the coroner's office had shown up at her door. 2 months since they'd ripped out her heart. 2 months, and she was still running from the grief. Shouldn't the raw, open wound left by Mike's loss have closed by now? Even a little? Some days it hurt so badly, Rae found it hard to believe people couldn't tell she was bleeding out emotionally, right in front of them. But no, she had to put on a brave face. Grief was such a private thing. It made people uncomfortable if she showed it openly, like if she'd shown up to an event wearing only her undies. Rae had learned to wear the face they wanted to see, that of a resilient young widow with 2 small children who was moving on. But those people didn't have to come home to an apartment every night that echoed with her late husband's absence. She had to stop this, had to fight this crippling lethargy. So what if it was the 2-month anniversary of Mike's death? So what if it was her birthday? So what that no one, neither her dad nor Mike's parents, had remembered? She had to stop wallowing in this despair. Rae stared at the afternoon light coming through her window. It was getting darker so much earlier now. Every day she had to face coming home sooner to the apartment after work. At the park, where she and the kids had spent so much time these last 2 months, she was able to pretend Mike would be home when they returned, and that he'd joyously sweep them into his arms. Her eyes stung. The children. She had to focus on them. They needed her. If she succumbed to this despondency, they had no one else. Rae forced herself to sit up. She slid her legs to the side of the bed and stood. What should she do? The laundry was finished, the apartment immaculate. They'd already been to the park once today. Start living your life again. I want you to be happy. She heard the words as though Mike had spoken them to her. Closing her burning eyes, she imagined him standing behind her, his arms encircling her. It made her feel cared for again. He was right. She had to be strong, if not for herself, then for those 2 little children. She recalled a friend from high school whose wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with 2 young children as well. He'd completely disconnected emotionally. She'd felt so badly for those kids. They'd lost their mother and then, essentially, their father, too. Rae opened her eyes, a sense of purpose filling her. She refused to do that to her children. Her own mother had died when she was a teen, and she'd had to do the mothering thing on her own. Dad was a loving but emotionally distant grandfather. It wasn't like Rae could drop in at his house for a cup of coffee and a word of advice. So, what should she do to start living again? Preston and Beth needed Rae to be all there for them, to model appropriate behavior. With that thought, she knew what to do. Since it was her birthday, she'd make a birthday cake. She went to the kitchen and pulled out the recipe book that had belonged to her mother. Every year until her death, she'd made a banana cake for Rae's birthday. She glanced at the counter. Preston and Beth had split the last banana for lunch. She listened for sounds of the children waking from their naps. Nothing, so no quick trip to the store. Rae flipped through the book. At work, they'd passed around a recipe for a lemon cake. Beth loved lemon. She had the ingredients to make chocolate frosting, and Preston liked chocolate. That should be an interesting combination of flavors. Thinking how happy her children would be, Rae's spirits lifted, and she hummed to herself while she mixed the ingredients for the cake. After she'd finished washing the dishes, she heard a noise from the bedroom. Once one of them woke up, it wouldn't be long before they both were awake. She peeked in the bedroom door. Beth stood in her crib, one chubby little leg lifted as though she meant to climb over the side. Rae was going to have to break down and buy that kiddie bed. As with Preston, she and Mike would normally have done it as soon as their daughter started walking. Precocious Beth had ruined that by walking at 10 months, and Rae hadn't been able to bring herself to make the purchase. She'd wanted to keep her little girl a baby a little longer. She reached out her hands and wiggled her fingers, inviting her mama to come and lift her from the crib. Rae did, and Beth squeezed her arms around Rae's neck. She buried her face in the child's blonde curls. Somehow, holding her sweet baby who looked so much like Mike, the loneliness eased back a little, like the tiny flame of a candle pushed back the darkness. When they'd first talked about starting their family, she'd never imagined how much she'd love her children, how much they would change her. "Hey, Mama." Preston rolled off his bed and rubbed his eyes. He paused and sniffed the air. "Something smells good." "That's because I'm baking." "What?" His eyes went wide. He grabbed his privates and started doing a little dance in place. "Just go to the bathroom, silly," Rae said, and he took off running. Beth gave a squeal of frustration and tried to wiggle free. "I have to change your diaper first," Rae said. The bright child squinted, seeming to analyze her mother. Whenever she did that, Rae had a feeling she was in for it when Beth got to be a teenager. "If you want a treat later, you better behave now." When Beth let out a dramatic sigh, Rae took that as acquiescence and put her on the changing table. As she worked, Rae's thoughts drifted back to the image of her daughter as a teenager. In almost 16 years, she'd be an adult. 16 years. It seemed like such a long time to do the single-parent thing alone. The children wouldn't remember Mike. She would need to look for ways to make him seem real to them. "Did you wash your hands?" she asked Preston when he returned. He heaved a sigh and turned back. Did they always have to push the boundaries? After finishing with Beth, Rae checked on Preston's cleaning job and washed her hands, too. "When will it be cooked?" He made a sniffing sound as they passed the kitchen. "About 20 more minutes, but then it has to cool before I can frost it." Her son looked longingly at the oven, but skipped into the living room and dove into their toy box, Beth on his heels. Rae had already packed the majority of their toys in preparation for the move on the 1st. When she unpacked them, the toys would be like new, and it would seem like Christmas in October to them. Maybe she'd have to separate their toys into batches and rotate them. Beth tugged on Rae's jeans leg, so she picked up her daughter. Scanning the room's bare walls, she knew she'd probably jumped the gun. She'd had most of the packing done for a couple of weeks, but It provided her with something to do when the children had gone to bed and she couldn't sleep, which lately was most of the time. She still felt conflicted about moving from the place where she and Mike had lived, but it held too many reminders of what she'd lost. Besides, she needed 3 bedrooms. That's what she told herself anyway. A shadow passed her kitchen window, and Rae turned toward it. Dylan Raidmaker, one of her coworkers, stood on the courtyard pathway outside her apartment, apparently talking to someone. She stepped out her door and found he was holding a box with the word kitchen written on it. "Are you helping someone move, Dylan?" she asked. "Hi there, Rae," he said, shooting her a quick glance before setting down the box and dashing back the direction he'd come. "Oh, no, you don't." A small, giggling figure was running away on short legs. It only took a few of Dylan's long strides to catch up. She knew he was single and wondered who the little boy was. Dylan scooped him up and blew on his belly. The child squealed with delight before being hefted onto large shoulders. "Who's that, Mama?" Preston asked, sliding his hand into hers, his little voice full of longing that twisted her heart. He missed his father a lot, and it tended to show itself at unexpected times. "That's Dylan from work," Rae said. "He was at the picnic. Do you remember?" Her son shook his head. She wasn't surprised he didn't recall it. Mike had died the next day. "This is where you live?" Dylan came to stand beside the box he'd set down. "For right now. At the end of the month, we're moving to a larger apartment down there." She pointed in the direction he'd been heading. "Ow, Jaden, don't pull my hair." He lifted the boy and blew on his belly again before setting him on the ground. Keeping a hold on the child's hand, Dylan asked Rae, "Which apartment will you be in?" Rae released Preston's hand and set a squirming Beth on the ground. Her son and the little boy stared at each other. "Apartment 210, she said. "It's one of the townhomes." "What do you know? We'll be neighbors." Dylan nodded toward the box. "We're moving into 209. That wouldn't be bad. It'd be nice to know her next-door neighbor. Rae glanced up the walkway that led to the parking lot, looking for more people. She and Dylan worked for a pest control company with an office a mile away. "Aren't the guys coming to help you move?" "I didn't know I could get into the apartment this evening, so they'll be here tomorrow to help with the big stuff." Dylan bent over and said to Jaden, "Why don't you ask his name?" "Sorry, I should have introduced them," Rae said. "This little lady is Beth, and this is Preston. He just turned 4. Her son didn't say anything but lifted his hand to show 4 fingers. "I'm this many." Jaden struggled to work his fingers, and Dylan had to help him press some down so the boy could show 3 raised fingers. "How many will you be next month?" Dylan asked. 4. The little boy had an easier time raising 4 fingers. "On Halloween." "That would make for a fun party." Rae tried to remember if Dylan was divorced. "Is he your son?" "He's my nephew." "What are you moving today?" "My kitchen. Amelia said I'd be able to put up with a lot of chaos if I had a bed to sleep in and a working kitchen. That's especially important now that I've got this little guy with me." Amelia was the office manager at work, a motherly woman who watched out for all the staff. "That's smart." Rae glanced at her apartment. "I should probably do that too. I can get into the new apartment the night before." "I've never gone wrong taking Amelia's advice." Dylan glanced toward his new apartment. "Well, I should probably get busy." "Can I help you with anything?" "That's nice of you." Dylan grinned at the children. "But I'm not sure how much you could do, seeing as you have 2 little kids of your own to watch." "Would Jaden like to play with Preston while you work?" She glanced at the 2 boys who weren't speaking, but were showing off what they could do with their fingers. "Would that be all right? I wouldn't want to impose." Dylan looked relieved. "Sure," she said. "They'll entertain each other." "Thank you so much." Dylan squatted next to his nephew. "Would you like to play at Preston's house while I work?" When the boy nodded, Dylan stood. "I appreciate it. Let me give you my number, though I won't be far." They exchanged phone numbers, and Rae herded the children inside her apartment. "Balls!" Jaden ran to jump into the small blow-up pool that they kept for the soft plastic balls. Preston and Beth dove in after him, and the three of them started tossing the toys around the living room. The oven timer buzzed, and Rae checked the cake. She set it on the cooling rack and started pulling out the ingredients for the frosting. She checked the clock. It'd be time to start dinner soon. Since she'd be cooking anyway, she might as well make enough for Jaden and Dylan. Then he wouldn't have to worry about it. When she had the casserole in the oven, Rae went into the living room and played with the children for a little while. She then read them a few books before putting on a video and heading to the kitchen to frost the cake. As soon as she started the mixer, the three little ones surrounded her. "Hang on," she said, laughing. "We can't all frost the cake. I'll let you each decorate a graham cracker with the leftover frosting, but not until after dinner. You boys sit on that side of the table." She put Beth in her high chair while Preston and Jaden scrambled into their seats. Rae had taken a cake decorating class once and enjoyed the artistry. She didn't make them except for special occasions. Otherwise, she'd have to buy a larger wardrobe. "What's a cake for, Mama?" Preston asked. "It's my birthday." She kept her voice steady. It had turned out to be a good afternoon, and she didn't want to ruin it by jumping into another pity party. "Your birthday?" Her son glanced around the room like he was searching for something. "Where's your presents?" Having celebrated his own birthday last month, he remembered gifts. A pang of loss struck Rae hard. A lump immediately formed in her throat, so large that it hurt. Mike had always made birthdays a special occasion. That morning, when she'd opened her jewelry box for a pair of earrings, she'd seen his gift from last year. A bracelet with charms Preston had helped to pick out. Unable to deal with that particular reminder that day, she'd closed the drawer. "Who's going to give me presents?" Rae wiped at her eyes, making her tone teasing for her son. "You?" At his stricken expression, she wished back the words. She made a pfft sound. "I have you and Beth. I don't need anything else." Rae blinked, embracing the truth of those words for the first time that day. Preston's expression brightened, but didn't clear completely. "I'm glad I bought some graham crackers," she said, trying to distract him. "I think I still have some sprinkles that you three can decorate them with." "Can I have cake and graham crackers?" Jaden asked. "Yeah, Mama. Can we share your cake with our new friends?" Preston asked. "And what new friends are those?" Dylan's voice came from the kitchen window. "Dilly!" Jaden ran to push open the screen door and throw himself at his uncle. "Dilly? Nice." Rae grinned as she picked up the cake and moved it to the breakfast bar. "What can I say? When a kid gives you a nickname, you have to take it." Dylan put down the boy. "Thanks so much for watching him. I got it done in probably half the time than if he'd been there underfoot. He's a great kid, but he's curious about everything." "I made a casserole, so you and Jaden are welcome to eat with us." Rae indicated the set table. "I kind of promised him that he could decorate graham crackers after dinner." "And eat birthday cake," Jaden added. "Whose birthday is it?" Dylan asked. "My mom's, but I don't have a present for her." Preston shot her an accusing glance. "She didn't tell me." "I already said you and Beth are the only presents I need." Rae rolled her eyes at Dylan, and he smiled sympathetically. "Well, if you don't mind Jay and I crashing your party, we'd be happy to eat with you. Babysitting and dinner." Dylan bent over and tickled his nephew. "I think we made out like bandits today, little dude." "Great, but these three need to pick up the living room before someone trips and falls. Beth, can you help the big boys pick up the balls?" Rae watched, pleased as Preston took the hint and clasped his sister's hand to lead her back into the living room. Sometimes he could be such a brat to her, while at other times he was like this. He had a good heart, and she tried to reinforce that behavior. "What can I do to help?" Dylan was already washing his hands in the kitchen sink. "I just need to make a salad." "I can cut up veggies." He glanced around for something to dry his hands with, and Rae handed him a towel. "The cutting boards are in there." She pointed to the cupboard beside him. While Dylan started going through it, she pulled out the produce from the fridge. They worked side by side. It reminded her of when they'd helped with last year's work Christmas party. She chuckled. "What?" he asked. "Did you ever notice that we always get the vegetable duty?" "I guess that's because we're so good at it. Would you let Tomas do the vegetable trays?" "We'd be making a visit to the ER." Poor Tomas was one of the salesmen. He'd been with the company for nearly 20 years and was good at what he did. But he was a menace when it came to food preparation. The first year she'd started there, he'd managed to catch the grill on fire during the summer barbecue. Then, while preparing for the Christmas party, he'd nearly cut his finger bad enough to require stitches. Now they only let him do the drinks. He could handle ice. "Is Jaden visiting you today or the whole weekend?" Dylan's expression turned troubled. "Sorry," Rae said, concerned at his discomfort. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right. He's with me until further notice." Dylan hesitated but then lowered his voice. "His mother's in rehab." "Oh, I'm so sorry." Rae was curious about what was going on. They'd been casual work friends for years, and this was the first she'd heard about his sister having addiction problems. Was it something new? Had the sudden addition of his nephew made it necessary for Dylan to move? It seemed too personal a question to ask. "Do you think Jaden would like to come to play with Preston tomorrow while you're moving?" she asked. "Really?" Dylan gave her a sidelong glance but continued slicing a cucumber. "You wouldn't mind watching him again? I'm not used to keeping my eyes on a yard ape all the time. I'd worry less if he were here." "They seem to have hit it off. I think it'd be good for Preston. The only other boy at his sitter's house moved last week. I dread the day when he decides girls aren't fun," Rae sighed. "But maybe I dread even more the day he decides they're too fun." "I vaguely remember going through both those stages myself," Dylan said with a soft chuckle. "It feels like ancient history." She vaguely remembered him bringing his girlfriend to the Christmas party last year. Was she out of town, and that was why she hadn't come to help him set up his kitchen? Or had they broken up? If he were alone again, Rae could sympathize. They finished the salad preparation, and she sent him to put the bowl on the table while she retrieved a couple of salad dressing bottles from the fridge. She set the casserole on the table and called the children. The two boys chattered during the meal, and Dylan spent most of his time trying to get Beth to talk her baby gibberish to him. He didn't exactly laugh at her, but the twinkle in his eyes warmed Rae's heart. For some reason, it pleased her that he found her daughter so amusing. "Do you have candles for the birthday cake?" Dylan asked when they'd finished clearing the table. "I don't need to count years anymore," she said. "You have to have candles, Mama." Preston sent her a pleading look while Dylan sat there nodding, looking all innocent, like it was obvious that she needed them on her cake. "Fine. Let me see if there are any left over from Preston's birthday." There were, of course, since she'd bought a new box and he'd only needed 4 of them. She removed 3 from the box and brought them to the table. "Perfect. There are 3 left," she said. "How's that perfect? 3 was fine for Jaden last year, but it doesn't fit you, Rae." Dylan folded his arms and put on a challenging expression. The 2 little boys then copied him. "Seriously?" Rae lifted her chin and tried for a haughty look. "When one reaches a certain age, it's appropriate to simply acknowledge one's advanced years. 1 candle will represent yesterday." She poked it into the cake. "1 will be for today. And this one is for tomorrow." She smirked at the 3 of them, though the children looked back with confusion. "I like it," Dylan said. "But how old are you?" "One never asks a lady's age," Rae said with a scowl. "What are you, your grandma?" Dylan asked. "She's 27, right, Mama?" Preston said. "Ancient," Dylan said, his expression serious but his eyes twinkling. He glanced at the boys, and they both nodded. "How old are you, Mr. Wise Guy?" she asked defiantly. "26 and proud of it," Dylan said. "We aren't afraid to admit our age, right, guys? You two boys told how old you were when you first met. The only one we don't know is—" He'd been turning toward the high chair, but broke off with a laugh. Beth had fallen asleep. Poor baby. Rae rose. How could she have let herself become so diverted by the company? "Why don't you cut the cake while I put her to bed?" "She's fine." Dylan shifted Beth's head to a more comfortable position. "See? You shouldn't miss any of your own party." "We had to sing happy birthday first," Preston said. "Yeah, it'll be good practice for Jaden's birthday next month." Dylan got them started but sang so softly that Rae had to strain to hear him at all. "I expected more from the singing pest control man," Rae said when they'd finished. For years, she'd been hearing about how he sometimes sang for his clients, but no one at the office had been able to convince him to give them a demonstration. "That's just something to pass the time," Dylan shrugged. As she cut the cake and handed out the plates, she wondered why he continued to work at a job he apparently didn't enjoy. Not that she'd want to be out in the field spraying people's homes with chemicals either. She'd been a bookkeeper there for 3 years, and he'd been there when she started. Dylan had taken a bite of cake and then paused, a funny expression crossing his face. He started chewing again, slowly, and then nodded. He swallowed. "Lemon," he said. "I thought it was just a yellow cake, but it's lemon." "A surprise for the taste buds," she said. "I love the combination." "It's really good." He took another bite, and once again took his time, seeming to savor the combination of the lemon and the chocolate. A sense of pleasure filled Rae that she hadn't felt in a couple of months. Preston would eat anything, but Beth was a picky eater. They often taunted each other at meal times, and it wore Rae out. It was a pleasure to have someone actually enjoy something she'd made. The 2 little boys even seemed to like theirs. When they finished eating, she went to the cupboard for the graham crackers and sprinkles. "I hope it's not too late for this," Rae said. "We're fine, but I think it'd be best to wrap it up for him to eat tomorrow." Dylan glanced at his nephew. "Otherwise, he might be bouncing off the walls tonight." "I understand that." As she helped Preston, she watched Dylan work on his own graham cracker while giving Jaden advice on his. "When I was a kid, we didn't make Christmas gingerbread houses," he said as he piled a few more sprinkles onto his mountain of frosting. "We used graham crackers." "I have a killer gingerbread recipe, and we use it to make gingerbread trees," Rae said. "How do you do that?" Dylan asked. "You cut it out in the shape of a leaf and bake them with the sides curving up a little. My dough is firm so they don't fall apart once they cool off. I use Christmas tree hooks to attach them to styrofoam cones." "Sounds like something Jaden might enjoy." "We're going to be neighbors. If he's around when we do them, you're welcome to come over." "Great." Dylan rose. "Well, little dude, it's time for us to get you home and to bed. I have to finish packing after your snoozing away." His nephew gave a sleepy nod, and Rae got some storage bags for them. She and Preston escorted them to the door. "The guys are supposed to come over at 10 tomorrow," Dylan said. "Can I drop him off half an hour before so I can pick up the truck?" "We'll be here." "Thanks again, Rae, for everything." He lifted Jaden onto his shoulders and strode away. A few steps out, he started to whistle. "That was fun," Preston said. Yes, it was. Smiling, she and her son went back inside the apartment. The day had ended much better than it had begun. Chapter 2. After dropping Jaden off at Rae's apartment the next morning, Dylan couldn't help grinning. His nephew hadn't stopped talking about playing with Preston. Thinking about it, Dylan had to agree that spending the time with Rae's little family had been a great way to end the day. It'd been the first breath of normalcy since he'd been given temporary custody. Not that it'd been the same kind of normalcy he'd had 3 months ago. Life, as he'd known it as a single guy, had come to an end. Dylan's life now centered around his job and caring for Jaden. He was the reason for the move. The old apartment complex hadn't had many little kids. One of the first things Dylan had noticed when he'd checked out the new complex was how many kids were using the playground. He'd come purposely late enough in the day that school would have let out so he could check. The individual buildings also formed a courtyard with green spaces in the center. Jaden was a curious and fearless little boy. Dylan didn't want it to be a deadly combination. Finding that Rae lived in his building had been a pleasant surprise. He'd felt badly for her when he'd heard about the death of her husband in a car crash. At work, Dylan had chipped in to buy flowers for the funeral. He'd been too consumed with learning how to care for a 3-year-old to give her situation much thought. Seeing her last night, the sadness that she must hide at work, so evident in her expression, had struck him. There she was, just like him, raising those kids by herself. Dylan's situation might be temporary. Hers was not. He'd felt an unexpected connection with her then. By the time he picked up the truck and returned to his old complex, the gang from work was already there. They made short work of it, and then they headed to the new complex. He'd ordered pizza to be delivered at noon. While they ate, he returned the truck. A couple of guys stayed to help him assemble the beds, and then they took off. Dylan glanced around the apartment at the haphazard placement of the boxes. The only order was in the kitchen, exactly as Amelia had said. He'd have to thank her for that bit of advice. Should he try to make sense of the chaos before picking up Jaden? Probably not. Leaving him with Rae would be taking advantage of her generosity. She had enough to deal with. Dylan locked his door and paused at the landing. The middle part of the building only had 2 stories, but the end units were 3 levels high. The ground floor end apartments had 1 bedroom, with the unit above being the townhome. The only way to access the 3rd floor of Rae's new apartment would be from the inside. It gave him a surprising sense of comfort that in a few days she'd be living next door. It'd be good to have Jaden's new best friend so close. Dylan skipped down the stairs and turned toward Rae's apartment. She was already headed his way, the children in tow. "I saw the others leave," she called, "and thought you might like some help putting your apartment in order." "If you don't mind." He lifted Jaden and set him on his shoulders. They spent the afternoon sorting the boxes. That'd been another bit of Amelia's advice, marking the boxes by room. Rae had taken the children into Jaden's room while Dylan worked at setting up his computer and sound system in the living room. For some reason, Beth had decided she wanted to play wherever he was. When he went into the kitchen with a box, she'd followed him. Then he'd moved one to the bathroom, and she'd tagged along. When he'd returned to the living room, his little shadow came along. Rae had collected her for a diaper change, but then Beth resumed her search for Dylan again. He paused, keyboard in hand, and watched the toddler playing with a toy. Was she drawn to him because he was a man and she missed the man in her life? How did a small child who couldn't comprehend death handle the reality of it? All the poor kid knew was that her daddy wasn't there anymore. Jaden's loser father had never been a part of his life, but the little guy missed his mother and didn't understand why he couldn't live with her anymore. Dylan was making sure to fill in the gap for his nephew. He'd have to see if he could do the same thing for Beth. "We have Jaden's room set up the way he wants it," Rae said, coming into the living room with the 2 little boys following. "I appreciate it." Dylan rose from his computer desk. "Can I pay you all back by taking you to dinner?" "Today's our obligatory monthly dinner at my father's." She picked up Beth. "But thank you." "Another time, then." He and Jaden walked them to the door and watched as they went down the stairs. Entering their new apartment again, they both paused and looked around the room. Dylan glanced down and found his nephew frowning. "What's up?" "How come it's lonely here now?" Jaden slid his hand into Dylan's. "Because this is a bigger apartment." The boy shook his head. "Because Preston's gone?" Jaden nodded. "Then I have a happy surprise for you." Dylan opened the front door again and pointed to the other apartment. "He's moving there next week." His nephew's entire face lit up, and he grinned. My thoughts exactly, little dude. Chapter 3. Looking back, Rae realized that her birthday, dismal as it had begun, had started her climb out of the depths of despair she'd lived in for the first 2 months following Mike's death. Dylan had repaid her for babysitting Jaden twice by helping not only move her own furniture, but unpacking it as well. When she'd first decided on the townhouse, she'd been a little concerned that the 2-story apartment wasn't on the ground floor. Dylan and Jaden being so close had turned out to be an unexpected advantage. The boys had become best friends and were constantly going back and forth to each other's apartment, so much so that they left the front doors open. When she'd expressed frustrated concern about Beth taking a tumble down the steps, Dylan had taken the matter in hand. He'd gotten permission from the office to install a gate at the top of the stairs. Rae wasn't sure what they'd do when colder weather forced a stop to the open-door policy. "I'm not sure what kind of birthday party to give Jaden," Dylan said a few days before Halloween when he turned in his work receipts to her one late afternoon. "I mean, it'd be cool to theme it to the holiday, but I'm afraid his birthday will get lost in it. I want to make it special for him." "You could always do like I did with my Christmas baby," Amelia said from the front counter where she waited for a customer to finish filling out some paperwork. "What was that?" Rae was always game for new ideas. "We celebrated his half-birthday in June," the older woman said. "Summer was easier for parties anyway, and his special day didn't get lost in the holiday rush." "That's an idea for next year, I guess." Dylan sank into the chair beside Rae's desk. "It won't work this time." "Let's consider your options then." She raised a finger. "You can have his party on Halloween, but try to focus the attention on his birthday rather than the trick-or-treating. Since you don't want to do the half-birthday thing, you could celebrate it on a different day than the holiday. He's only 4, and I doubt he'd know the difference. When I was a kid, my parents had my birthday parties on weekends. I survived." "She's right, you know. She usually is." Amelia winked at Rae and then turned to help the customer who'd returned to the counter. "I know you're trying for routine," Rae said, "but I think he'd be okay with changing the day if you explained it to him." "He has so much turmoil in his life right now," Dylan said, his voice quiet. "The meeting with his mother didn't go well?" "Nora can't take care of herself right now, much less give him what he needs." Dylan rubbed his face. "It confuses him. She's completely wrapped up in herself. He misses her, but she's not there, even when she's there, if that makes sense." "It does." After more than a month of being in Dylan's confidence, Rae thought she understood too well. She had a bad feeling that Jaden's mother might always be a ghost in his life. Rae decided to ask the question she'd been dying to ask, but had avoided. "Where are your parents in all this?" He heaved out a breath, and for a second looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sometimes she thought he did. "Our mom died when I was 12, he said. "Dad remarried less than a year later. With both of us feeling like he'd replaced our mother too soon, it created some uncomfortable dynamics. It didn't help that the woman he married was more interested in traveling than caring for someone else's kids." Something else they had in common. Rae reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's cold, but I understand. My stepmother isn't that bad, but she's only good at surface things. She likes giving presents, but she can't handle the emotional stuff. When Mike was killed, my father wasn't available to help me because she was so devastated. She had to see her therapist in another part of the state to help her cope." Rae had received birthday cards from her father and Mike's parents 2 days late. But then her attitude had turned around and she'd appreciated the thought. They hadn't been able to control the postal system. Dylan and Jaden had rescued her that day. Her eyes burned and she blinked, swallowing. "I'm sorry." Dylan met her gaze with his warm brown eyes. "I want my little dude to have a better experience growing up than his mom and I did." "You know, I'll help you with anything." Rae picked up her phone and opened a browser. "Have you asked him what he'd like to do?" "He wants pizza," Dylan said with a chuckle. "Then give him a pizza party. There's that bowling alley that has a game center. They serve pizza there. Halloween's a Monday this year, so you could have his party on Saturday. I can help you make up some invitations so he can invite some kids from his daycare. You only have to decide how much you can afford to spend. If you want, I'll bake him a cake." "He liked that lemon and chocolate one you made on your birthday." "Don't you mean you liked it?" Rae didn't quite roll her eyes. "Well, sure, but that's all he talked about the next day." "Then I'll bake him a lemon cake." She put away her phone. "He ought to enjoy a party with friends at a game center." "Yeah, he should." Dylan stood. "Thanks for being such a good friend, Rae. You've made things a lot easier." "You and Jaden have been good for me, too." She rubbed her temples. "I wasn't doing well on my birthday, but you two helped turn me around. Thank you." Dylan grinned and gave an awkward bow. "Rescuing damsels in distress is one of my favorite things to do." Rae snorted. "If you're talking about serenading Mrs. Lipinski, I'm not sure that counts." "Ah, but she'd just come home from the hospital after breaking her hip." He shrugged. "She loved it and asked for an encore." "What did you sing to her?" Dylan's ears turned pink and he shook his head. "Don't be cruel," Amelia said, coming up to him and putting a hand on his shoulder. He grunted, his neck now darkening to match his ears. It was adorable, but why was he so embarrassed? Here, if he was okay singing while he did his root. "You did Elvis?" Rae asked, envious that the old woman had gotten to hear him. "What was the encore?" "Pretty Woman," Amelia grinned. "That's so unfair." Rae pinned him with a disgusted look, but he only shrugged. Somehow she was going to hear him yet. She'd have to ask Jaden if his uncle ever did it for him. If so, maybe she could get Dylan to sing for Beth. "Don't look at me like that," Dylan said, eyeing her. "What? You're the singing pest control man. For everyone but your office." Rae powered off her computer and picked up her purse. "Let me know the details for Jaden's party on Saturday." She strode out to her car. Carrying the pizza to the table, Dylan took the time to admire how Rae gathered the small group of children. It was a good thing she'd left Beth in the facility's daycare center, the way that independent little girl liked to wander off on her own. Rae was one of the most capable women he'd met, but it'd have been too much to watch the toddler, too. The suggestion to have the party here had been brilliant. Surrounded by his friends, Jaden practically glowed with the positive attention. All because Rae was watching out for the two of them. The thought made Dylan pause mentally. Yes, she was watching out for him and his nephew. What would he have done today without her? For that matter, what would he have done these last few weeks without her? Since they'd become neighbors, he'd felt much more confident in his role as parental figure. Rae was the comfortable place he went when his insecurities threatened to overwhelm him. He'd never known anyone before who brought out the very best in him. She glanced in his direction, the corners of her mouth quirking up. His heart leaped and his pulse sped up. Had she looked at Mike like that? How pathetic to be jealous of a dead man. Last week, when Dylan had gone with her to the cemetery, he'd realized he wanted more from Rae than friendship. As she'd knelt by the grave and wept, he'd accepted that she wasn't emotionally available. Yet, he'd wanted to hold her, to comfort her. Instead, he'd forced himself to watch, and then when she'd risen, to lamely squeeze her hand. Dylan had told himself it was all right that he had to wait. He could be patient, he hoped. He did want to thank her for all she'd done for the party. Taking her to dinner would normally have been the way to do it. But what if she misinterpreted it and pulled away? Unless... Maybe if he went on a date with someone, then Rae wouldn't get suspicious that he had feelings for her. In the meantime, he'd invite them over for dinner again. Their two families shared several meals a week as it was. "I think this has worked out well," Rae said as she sat beside him on the bench. She blew a breath upward and a wayward strand of hair fluffed up. Chuckling, he reached over and brushed it aside, but then immediately pulled back his hands. He nodded to where Jaden was talking animatedly to everyone. Look at him. He talks sometimes about missing his mother, but he seems to have adjusted well. I think you've given him the security he's needed. Rae heaved out a breath. Now, if I could get Preston to look so happy. It is a little different for him, Dylan said. At least Jaden gets to see his mom, even if it confuses him that he can't live with her. How's the halfway house working out? I found out last night that she's back in rehab. I'm sorry. Rae covered his hand with hers, and Dylan forced himself not to move. I've tried to explain to him that she's sick, and it can take a long time to get better, he shrugged. Preston came running up and stretched out his foot. She leaned forward and talked him through tying the brightly colored lace. Why don't you get him a Velcro pair? Dylan asked, missing the warmth of her hand on his. Then you wouldn't have to keep doing that. He likes the fun laces. Rae straightened, wearing a mischievous grin. Wait until you see what we got Jaden for his birthday. Not laced shoes. It's what he asked for. You're going to have to teach him how to tie his laces anyway. He can't be 30 and wearing Velcro sneakers. You'll have to teach me how to teach him, then, because I have no idea. As fast as Preston is learning, he might be able to give Jaden lessons. Well, she said, rising, it looks like it's time to open presents. Dylan stood and followed Rae, letting her direct traffic. Acknowledging his growing feelings for her, felt like he was free. Where he'd been locked away in a dark cave before, it was like she'd opened a door and flooded his life with light. A sense of peace settled over him. He might not normally be a patient man, but Jaden, and now Rae, were teaching him patience. He needed to do this carefully and not go faster than she was ready for. What he needed to do was some research on grieving. Chapter 4. Rae glanced up from the box she was loading with their contributions to Thanksgiving dinner at her father's house. Preston stood anxiously by the front door, but he also kept looking at her surreptitiously. What was going on? What's up, little bud? She asked, using the nickname Dylan had given him. They'd taken to calling the boys the Littles. She had no idea what they'd call Beth if she decided she wanted a nickname too. Preston glanced at her and then away, looking guilty. He tended to be a rule keeper, sometimes too much so, assuming the role of the enforcer when he played with his sister or Jaden. Have you done something you shouldn't? His eyes went wide, and he shook his head feverishly. What then? He glanced back at the door and swallowed. Can I talk to Dilly? They're going to his father's house for dinner. Rae glanced at her watch. I don't know if they've left yet. Can I see? Preston edged closer to the entryway. Okay, but leave our door open. She hoped it wouldn't take too long. Preston scurried out and left it open a precise amount. He then rang the bell, and Dylan peeked his head out right away. Hey, little bud. Dylan glanced at her, and she shrugged. Sorry, he says he needs to talk to you, she called. I have to hurry and change Beth if that's okay. We don't have to leave for a few minutes. Dylan indicated she should go. I'll make sure he gets back home safely. Dylan reached across the hall and pulled Rae's door shut before ushering Preston inside his apartment. Oh, is Preston coming with us? Jaden cried, running in from his bedroom. No, he's going to his grandpa's house. It killed Dylan that he wasn't going to see Rae for most of the day. It'd taken all his self-control not to call and beg to go with her. That wouldn't have been fair to any of them, though. Did you finish packing the toys you want to bring? Jaden heaved a melodramatic sigh and turned back to his room. Dylan sat on the couch and signaled for Preston to join him. The boy came to stand beside him, leaning against Dylan's leg. The standoffish child had finally started warming up. He got plenty of physical attention from his mother, but Preston looked on jealously when Dylan and Jaden would hug. It was something Dylan understood since he was jealous whenever Preston got to hug his mother. "What's up, little bud?" "It's a secret," Preston whispered. The hair on the back of Dylan's neck stood on end. When he'd been a kid, his father had been big on stressing that there were to be no secrets. "What kind of secret?" he asked carefully. "I can't drive." Dylan blinked at the boy's serious and sincere little face. "Right." Dylan ran his hand comfortingly up and down the boy's back. "I couldn't drive when I was 4, either. So it's going to be a long time before you get to drive your mom's car." "But I have to go to the bank." "Why?" "That's where Mama put my birthday money." "Why do you need money?" "Mama didn't get any presents for her birthday." Preston's whole face glowed. "I'm going to make sure she gets a present for Christmas." The intensity in the child's words made Dylan's eyes sting. What a great kid. It'd been over 2 months since that day, and he hadn't forgotten. "Your mom will need to come with you if you go to the bank." When Preston's shoulders drooped, Dylan added, "But I can help you out. How about you do a few chores for me to earn some money, and I'll find a way to take you shopping." Preston threw his arms around Dylan's neck for the first time ever. He hugged the little boy back, trying to swallow against the sudden lump in his throat. "Happy Thanksgiving, little bud." Chapter 5. "I'm taking Jaden to do some last-minute Christmas shopping," Dylan said over breakfast the second Saturday in December. "Would you all like to come along?" "I don't know." Rae pulled a face. "I hate crowds and try to stay away from the retail stores after Thanksgiving. I'm sure Preston would like to come, though. He adores going anywhere with you." "Let me rephrase that. Will you come along? I promised Jaden he could talk to Santa, and I don't want to face the masses alone." Dylan shot her a pleading look that he was getting too good at. "Well," Rae said, "I did see a flyer from one of the stores there with an item I'd like to pick up." She was glad she didn't have to lie since it was for Dylan, a karaoke machine. He'd be hard-pressed not to let her hear him sing then. At the office, she and Amelia had conspired to one day follow him on his route and catch him at it. "Great," Dylan said. "But I'll need to split off from you." Rae shot a meaningful glance at the Littles who were carrying on their own conversation, hinting that they were the reason for her need to shop. She'd have to make sure to pick up something extra for each of them, too. "All right, that'll work. We'll ride there together and then split up," Dylan said. "We can meet at the food court for lunch after." "That should be fine." Rae had to force herself not to smile. This little jaunt would fit right in with her nefarious plan to hear him sing. She didn't mind the distraction either. Thanksgiving without Mike had been hard enough, but it'd only been 1 day. She'd been dreading an entire season without him. Looking after Jaden's needs and helping Dylan with him had kept her from falling into despair again. When they arrived at the mall, the children, even Beth, who didn't understand anything, stared at the decorations. Rae had forgotten how much they added to the festiveness. In spite of the crowd, she found herself getting excited to go inside. "Which direction are you going?" Dylan wiped his hands on his jeans, a sign of nervousness that she'd seen too often when he'd have to take Jaden to visit his mother. Rae hoped he hadn't received bad news. "You okay?" she asked. Dylan seemed to realize what he was doing and stopped. "Yeah, Santa's down that way." He pointed to the right. "Perfect. My store is that way." Rae indicated the left. "You'll be closer to the food court. If you finish before us, maybe you can get a table." "Text me when you're done." Rae turned with the stroller, but Dylan put his hand over hers on the handle. "Isn't Beth going to get her picture taken too?" he asked. "She's too young. He'll scare her." "Not if she's with the Littles. Come on, Do you really want to have a picture of Preston, but not one of Beth? Well, Rae hadn't considered that. When she's 16, she'll want to know why you have a picture of Preston with Santa and not one of her. He arched a brow, his head tilted. She'll play the "you love him more than me" card. Rae frowned, but he had a point. Baby, do you want to go with Preston? When Beth nodded, Rae heaved out a breath and stepped back so Dylan could take hold of the stroller. Okay, guys, each of you put a hand over mine. They did, and the four of them strode toward the Santa Claus line. Rae's eyes prickled. That man had been heaven sent. She'd worried how she could ever fill the hole that Mike's death had left in her children's lives. And then Dylan had shown up. Sniffling, she headed toward the electronics store. By the time she reached it, he'd texted 2 pictures. One, a selfie of the 4 of them, was in front of a giant stuffed reindeer. The other was of a woman dressed like an elf, kneeling in front of the stroller, giving Beth a candy cane. It made Rae wish she'd ordered the machine online so that she could have gone with them. The music store was crowded. When she found a sign for the item on her flyer, the shelf was empty. "Can I help you, ma'am?" a clerk asked. "You don't have any of these in the back, do you?" "I'm sorry, but we're sold out of those. However," the young man grinned at her, "our manager agreed to exchange this more expensive model for the sale price." "Oh, nice! Thank you, this is perfect!" It even came with an extra mic, so she wouldn't have to buy one. By the time she'd paid for it and had it wrapped in Christmas paper, Dylan had sent her 2 more pictures, the last one being an adorable shot of all 3 children sitting on Santa's lap. She'd have to hurry if she was going to pick up something for the littles. There was a candy store at the end of this wing of the mall that should have some fun options for stocking stuffers. Rae was looking through the candied apples and wondering if they'd last when her phone pinged with another text. "Taking a bathroom break." Another text came right after it. "Look who else is here. We'll meet you in 15 minutes. It pinged again, this time with a photo of Amelia holding Beth. Leave it to the large woman to come to the mall dressed like a stand-in for Mrs. Claus, with a red dress and green sweater. From her ears hung bell earrings. She'd worn them to work a couple of times and sounded like one of Santa's reindeer. "I'll head to the food court and look for a table. Will Amelia be eating with us?" "No, she says she's with another group." Rae settled on some pinwheels since they were mostly toy and only a little candy before making her way to the food court. It was full, but it looked like the worst of the lunch rush was over, and she was able to find a table for 4 next to a group of adults dressed in ugly Christmas sweaters. They looked like they were having a party, and it made her smile. She stood guard of their table while checking out the menus. Of the offerings, it appeared it'd be kids' meals for the littles and mac and cheese for Beth. "Rae!" She turned at the sound of her name. Dylan had Beth on his shoulders, while Amelia pushed the stroller the same way he'd done, with one of the boys each holding her hand on top of the handles. Had he learned that from her? "Don't you look festive?" Rae gave Amelia a hug before taking Beth from Dylan. "You know how much I love this time of year. You kids have fun." The grandmotherly woman kissed each of the children and went to sit with the group at the ugly sweater table. Only then did Rae see the garish embroidery on the back of Amelia's sweater. "Oh, you've got candy cane on your hand." Rae rubbed at the red color on Beth's finger. "How weird, it's like paint." "The littles want kids' meals. What are you getting?" Dylan wiped his hands on his pants again. Seriously, what was bothering him today? "She'll only eat mac and cheese in a place like this, so I'll share with her." Rae glanced between the nearby fast food restaurant and the one across the room that sold mac and cheese. "We'll have to take turns watching the table." "I've got it covered." Dylan got Amelia's attention and pointed to the table with the stroller. She nodded, and he took the little's hands. Rae was impressed how efficient he'd become with the children. It was like he'd been born to be a father. As much as Mike had loved the kids, he'd never been this comfortable with them. Jaden was lucky to have a man like Dylan in his life. One day, he'd make some woman a wonderful husband. She turned toward the restaurant that advertised mac and cheese and found Amelia watching her. The woman grinned and mouthed, "I've got this." By the time Rae had gotten through the food line and returned, Beth had fallen asleep. Dylan jumped up and hurried over to take the sleeping child. Rae set down the food and adjusted the stroller. Once they'd settled the baby, Rae collapsed into a chair. "I'd forgotten how fun this can be," she said, "and how exhausting. My feet hurt." "You can relax now," Dylan said as he finished settling the boys with their food. "You can enjoy the music." He nodded to the center of the room where a man was setting up a speaker next to a young teen girl holding a violin. "Nice!" Rae shifted so she could see better. Once they were set up, the girl started to sing Ding Dong Merrily on High. Then two older girls stepped in and started to accompany her. When two other young women took position beside them, Rae gasped and fumbled for her phone, her pulse quickening with excitement. It had to be a flash mob. While she was putting her phone on record, the group continued to grow. On her right, Amelia and the people at her table rose, and so did Dylan on the left. Rae glanced up at him. Her jaw dropped when he pulled his sweater over his head to expose a red shirt in the same shade as Amelia's. He wiped his hands on his jeans, exhaled deeply, and stepped beside their coworker. Was he going to sing too? Rae's heart did a flip-flop in anticipation. The group finished, and Amelia immediately began to sing a lively version of I Saw Three Ships, not giving the audience a chance to applaud. Dylan joined her a couple of phrases in, blending his rich baritone with her soprano. Their beautiful harmony touched something deep inside of Rae. Her heart seemed to swell, and she felt like she was in the happiest of dreams. Then the other singers joined in again, and a group of Irish dancers skipped in to add to the performance. It was breathtaking. Rae hoped there were others recording it because it was something that should be preserved. Dylan finally met her gaze. His cheeks were flushed, but he couldn't hide the shaking of his hands. It must be hard for him to perform in public. No wonder he'd kept putting off her requests for him to sing for her. Yet Amelia had managed to talk him into it. The concert ended and the crowd gave them a thunderous applause. The participants and the shoppers all went back to what they'd been doing before. Rae put down her phone and ran to throw her arms around Amelia and Dylan. "You two were amazing!" Rae cried. "Everyone was!" Amelia laughed and Dylan looked embarrassed. "Maybe I can eat now that it's over," he said. "Who were all those people?" Rae asked once they'd sat down again. "The singers are from Amelia's church," Dylan said. "The musicians came from the college and the cloggers are from her granddaughter's dance class." "And you both kept this a secret from me." Rae shot Amelia a dark look, but she only laughed. "If he told you, I'd have had to kill him, and that wouldn't have been right, a good church-going woman like me murdering a handsome young man." "Is that what you've been doing these last 2 weeks when I've watched Jaden, those evenings for you? Going to practices?" Rae asked. "Yes." Dylan dug into his food. The poor guy looked more relaxed than he had in weeks, and now she knew why. "Just so you know, this was a bucket list item for me." Rae let out a deep sigh. "I'm so glad you talked me into coming. This was the best." Chapter 6. Dylan checked the timer on the oven, the smell of the ham making his stomach rumble. As with Thanksgiving, he and Rae would be spending Christmas Day with their separate families. But Christmas Eve was theirs. It'd been busy at work. He'd never paid attention to how many emergency bug infestations people called in on Christmas Eve. Until this year, he hadn't had a family of his own waiting for him. Well, a kind of family. One he hoped would be his one day. He'd only had to work a half day, fortunately. After cleaning up, he'd put on the ham. Rae had the whole day off, so she'd taken Jaden for him. She'd spent the morning baking and now had the children decorating sugar cookies. That left him time to finish his gift wrapping. The children had been easy to shop for, even Preston's special present for his mother. Dylan had consulted Amelia about it. That woman had solutions to everything. As he cut and taped packages, he thought about how differently this Christmas was from last year. With it likely Jaden could remain in Dylan's care indefinitely, his old friends had disappeared. They'd only wanted to work and party and had no time for a guy with a little boy tagging along. The surprising thing was that Dylan didn't mind. Looking back on his life before the little dude, it felt like he'd been in a holding pattern. He hoped Nora would pull her act together to be a mother again, but if she didn't, Dylan was prepared to carry on. He now had a purpose in life that had been absent before, and that didn't even count how much Rae and her kids had come to mean to him. Dylan picked up the jewelry box. He'd struggled over what to get her. He'd wanted it to be something personal, memorable, but it couldn't be too personal. If she felt pressure from him to make their relationship more than it was right now, she might pull back. He couldn't risk that. He opened the box and examined the simple gold chain. He'd wanted his and Jaden's gift for Rae to go with Preston's present, but as a compliment and not a distraction. Dylan had talked with the jeweler about a strong chain for the mother of a young child who liked to tug at necklaces. Rae could wear the chain by itself or put a locket on it. He hoped that every time she wore it, she'd think of him. He closed the box and put it in a special gift bag. Because of her situation, he'd given it a lot of thought and done online research about dating a widow. Not that he was dating her. He'd panicked last week when Amelia had casually mentioned that someone had asked Rae out to dinner. She'd refused, saying it was too soon. He'd heaved out a breath, and Amelia had given him a knowing grin. When the time came, he hoped she'd be in his court. Glancing at the packages, Dylan decided he was finished. The oven timer buzzed and he turned it off. He removed the pan and set it on the stovetop. It wouldn't be ready to cut for a few minutes anyway, so he gathered the packages and went to Rae's apartment. "I've come, bearing gifts," he called, knocking on the door with his elbow. The Littles and Beth looked up at him from the dining table, their hands and faces smeared with frosting. Rae laughed at his expression. "They're having dessert first." "I just pulled the ham out of the oven," Dylan said, kneeling by the tree. He spread his gifts around. There was one larger package in the back with his name on the label. He'd had a hunch about what she might give him, and the size of the box increased his suspicion. He looked up and met her gaze. She smiled but didn't say anything about it. "You can bring the ham while I get these 3 cleaned up." When he'd put the meat on Rae's oven top, he joined her in clearing the table. The cookies were a crazy assortment of colors and decorations. It looked like they'd had a lot of fun. Dylan glanced around the apartment as he wiped the table. She'd created a cozy atmosphere. One evening when she'd babysat Jaden, she and the children had decorated poster board stars with glitter. They now hung strategically from the ceiling. It made it feel like home here, something he hadn't experienced since before his mother had died. "I think that does it." Rae scanned the kitchen after dinner, checking that everything was cleaned. "You need to relax now." Dylan put his hand on her back and guided her to the couch. The children were watching a Christmas cartoon. "I meant to ask you last night, but how was the visit with Nora?" she whispered. "Not good. She relapsed again. My father is about to wash his hands of her. He's the one with the money. If he stops paying for her treatment, I don't know what she'll do." Dylan rubbed his face, his expression bleak. "When we were growing up, there was nothing either of us could do that was good enough for him. I think that's probably why we both acted out." "How did you act out?" Rae hoped he was finally opening up about this. He'd said a couple of things over the past few months about the relationship, but when she'd inquired further, he'd shut down. "I only went to college for a year. Dad's a rich attorney and was pressuring me to study law so I could come and work for him." The corner of Dylan's mouth quirked up. "I have a little oppositional defiance going on. If I'm pushed, I can go the other direction." Rae winced internally, hoping he wouldn't think her present was pushing, which of course it was. Her stomach knotted. She should have gotten a musical video game like Rock Band or something instead. "Is that how you went to work, doing pest control?" she asked. "I started working for them part-time before I left school. When I dropped out, they hired me full-time. It's a smelly job, but I get to spend my days outdoors, which I like. Before I got Jaden, I'd been thinking of taking some management classes so I could move up in the company and not always be one of the route guys." And now he couldn't go to school because he wanted to be there for his nephew and her little family. A tingling warmth of gratitude spread over her. What would she have done the past few months without his friendship? "You're a good man, Dylan Raidmaker," she whispered. "And you're just trying to soften me up." He shifted so he faced her instead of the children and grinned, one brow arched. "So I won't be offended by your Christmas present." Rae's jaw dropped, her face growing warm. "Ha! I'm right!" Dylan gently closed her mouth. "Your expression gives you away." "But how could you know?" She glanced at the children. "I made Preston promise not to tell you." "He didn't tell. He just asked what a karaoke machine was." Rae burst out laughing. "I've been having second thoughts anyway." She heaved out a breath. "You can take it back. I don't want you to feel forced to sing for me." "It's all right, Rae." "If you don't like performing in front of others, why do you sing on your route?" "I started it when my phone's battery died and I was bored. One of the houses I was spraying had a grandma who was recuperating from surgery." "Like Mrs. Lipinski?" Rae interrupted. "Yeah, the lady had her daughter ask if I'd do another song." Rae gave a dark chuckle. Since I could do it while I was outside and didn't have to look at her, it wasn't so bad, so I kept doing it. "So it's stage fright?" "Partly." He didn't look at her, and something in his expression reminded her of the way he'd looked when he talked about his dad. "Your father should not dictate whether or not you enjoy a wonderful talent," she said as sternly as she would have to Preston. "I love your voice." Dylan looked at her then in a way that sent a different kind of warmth flooding through her body. She blinked, surprised and confused, and frowned. "When do we open presents?" Jaden asked. Rae sighed with relief. "We only get to open one present on Christmas Eve," Preston said, playing the enforcement officer. She rose and glanced at Dylan. "What do you guys do?" "This is mine and Jaden's first Christmas together, remember? We can do whatever you'd like." "All right. We always read the Christmas story first." "Let's do it." After the reading, Rae turned on Christmas music and they gathered around the tree. Beth snuggled into Dylan's lap. "I know we usually only open one present on Christmas Eve, but I wonder if we should do something different this year since you're leaving early tomorrow for your dad's and we won't be together for this. Is it okay if we exchange our gifts tonight?" Rae indicated their two families. "That works," he said. "I think you should open mine and Jaden's present to you after you open Preston's." "All right, but we need to be careful or there won't be anything left for tomorrow." "Won't your parents have presents for them?" Dylan arched his brows. "And whatever Santa brings them?" "That's true. All right, I think they should open those first." She pointed to the packages with the pajamas. "Okay," Dylan said. Since Beth didn't show any sign of wanting to move, Rae gave the gifts to the children with an admonition to wait until they could all open them together. As soon as she gave the word, the littles started ripping off the paper. "Look, they match!" Preston cried as he held up his red and black checkered pajamas. "We're twins!" Jaden tore into the plastic covering. Dylan helped Beth open the package with her pink and black checkered ones. "Do you want Mama to help you put these on?" he asked. She looked up at him, her eyes drowsy, and patted his cheek. "Ooh, Daddy!" Rae's heart twisted, and her eyes filled with tears. Keeping the children busy had made it easier to push memories with Mike aside, but they all came flooding in. "No, I'm just Dilly." Dylan set Beth on the floor and gave her the package. "See if you can get these out." He rose and pulled Rae to her feet. "I thought you'd been handling today too well. Of course you miss him." He put his hands on her shoulders and forced her to meet his gaze. "Yes, Mike's gone, but that doesn't mean you can't embrace the great memories you have of him." Rae rested her head on his chest and wept. He embraced her, patting her back like he did when he was soothing an upset Beth. "Burp," she finally said with a sniff and looked up at him. "Thank you." "That's what friends are for." He grinned and stepped back. "Hey, I think I need to help you with that, little lady." While he worked with Beth, Rae put the trash into a bag she'd brought out for it. "We're dressed," Preston said, his arm around Jaden's shoulders. They grinned broadly at her. Rae took some more pictures. Dylan was right. She needed to work at appreciating what she'd had with Mike and not forgetting what a great life they'd had, as short as it'd been. "How do you want to do the rest of them?" Dylan asked, coming to stand beside her. "Should we stack their presents and let them go at them?" "That's what I'd do." "All right. Jaden," Rae asked, "do you know how to spell your name?" "Uh-huh." "All right, you and Preston see if you can find the presents with your names." She'd already set Beth's off to the side, so Rae retrieved them. She pulled her daughter onto her lap and waited until the guys were ready. Dylan carried his own packages to the couch and sat beside her. "All right," she said. "Go for it." The littles ripped into their presents, and Rae gave Beth one to open that held a doll. "Are you sure it'd be okay if I exchanged the machine for something else?" Dylan asked. "Of course." Rae tried to keep her disappointment from her voice, but didn't think she'd succeeded. "I've heard you sing," he said. "You have a pretty voice." She shot him a disbelieving glance. "I can sing on key, if that's what you mean, but I'm more choir material than a soloist like you." "If I keep this, will you sing with me?" Her heart thudded. She was no singer. "If you want me to sing for you, you have to sing with me." He nodded toward the piano near the stairs. "I've meant to ask you about that. I've never heard you play." "I haven't since Beth was born." "Are you good enough to accompany people?" "I guess, but not unless I practice. A lot." Her stomach knotted at the thought. "It'd make me nervous, though." "And now you feel my pain," Dylan grinned. "It's your choice about the machine. I'll keep it if you'll sing with me." "I'll think about it," she finally said. They then turned their focus to the children. While Dylan helped them choose one present to take out of its ridiculous inside packaging to play with, Rae went through the wrapping to make sure nothing important got thrown away. "I think Beth's finally had it," Rae said, rising. "I'm putting her to bed." While she changed her daughter's diaper and settled her in her bed, Rae thought back on the day. It had gone much better than she'd feared, even with her little breakdown. When Dylan finally decided to settle down with his own family, she was going to miss this. His wife wouldn't look kindly on him having a female friend. Rae would have to be solidly on her feet by then, and not need him so much. She listened for the guys as she went down the stairs. What were they whispering about? "Shh!" Dylan hissed as she came down the last steps. "What's going on?" she asked suspiciously. "You haven't opened any of your presents yet, Mama," Preston said. "This one's from Beth." Jaden brought her a square, flat package. "Let's see what it is." Rae accepted the gift and sat on the couch. The littles came to stand on each side of her, leaning in to see. She put an arm around each of the boys and kissed their temples. "I wonder what it is," she said. "We know," Preston said, his voice smug. "Open it." Jaden reached as though he meant to start on it himself, but Dylan pulled back the boy's hand and shook his head. Rae tore off the wrapping to expose a square plate with rounded corners and a raised rim. It took her a second to recognize the little green footprints hanging from a painted red string, topped with a bow. The words "mistletoes" and "Beth Cavanaugh," along with the year, had been carefully written underneath. Her fingerprints in alternating red and green lined the rim. "This is adorable!" Rae cried. "When did you do it?" "At the mall, of course," Dylan said. "Amelia helped me with it. Well, it was her idea, actually. It's a real plate, but I don't think you'll want to wash it." "I'll hang it on the wall." "Can we give her our present yet?" Jaden held up the gift bag. "Ours goes with Preston's," Dylan said. "But Rae should open his last." Jaden leaned on her leg, so Rae put her arm around him and reached into the gift bag. She pulled out a rectangular jewelry box. "What's this?" she asked. "I can show you how to open the box." Jaden reached for it, and she let him pop it open to expose a gold chain necklace. "This is beautiful. I hope it wasn't too expensive." "Jaden helped me pick it out. We owe you a lot for how much you've helped us the last few months." If he only knew how much the two of them had helped her. "Now you need to open Preston's gift to you." Dylan nodded to her son, who handed her a small package. "Before you open it, I want to tell you what a great boy you have." Dylan's voice cracked, and Rae looked at him in surprise, her own eyes stinging in sympathy. He coughed and continued. "He came to me and asked for help." "What kind of help?" Rae glanced at her little boy, who was anxiously staring at the package she held. "He told me his mother hadn't gotten any presents for her birthday, and he was going to make sure that she got something for Christmas." Rae's throat tightened, and she could hardly swallow. She pulled Preston closer, not even trying to fight the moisture running down her cheeks. "Open it, Mama," he pleaded. She released him and removed the colorful paper. It held a small box from a local jewelry store. "He's been doing a few projects for me to pay for it." Dylan's eyes twinkled. "He picked it out." Rae removed the lid from the box. Inside was a heart-shaped gold locket. It was thicker than any she'd seen before and had an odd clasp. Dylan reached over and did something to it. The heart sprung open, resembling a 4-leaf clover. Each of the hearts held a picture. She had to blink a few times before she could see what was inside each. One held a photo of Preston, one of Beth, and a third one was of their family. It'd been taken not long before Mike's death. The fourth leaf held a child's stick figure drawing that she guessed was Preston's attempt at a self-portrait. "I had to stalk social media for the pictures," Dylan said. "Preston drew that for you, and I had it shrunk to fit." Rae closed her eyes, her heart swelling, the emotion nearly overwhelming her. "Don't you like it, Mama?" Preston asked. "Oh, sweetheart, it's the perfect present." She embraced him, and he put his arms around her neck. Yes, she was holding the best gift she could ever want. Excerpt from The Lasting Gift. Dylan stepped into the office, grateful to be out of the rain. A couple of his accounts had called to reschedule their service, even though he'd explained that the rain wouldn't be a problem. He'd have to play catch-up for the houses he wasn't able to spray today. Sometimes the spring could be a pain. He hung up his rain gear and pulled out the money from the customers who liked to pay in cash. When it was raining, he had to be careful not to end up with soggy bills to turn in. That drove Rae crazy. Rae. His heart swelled whenever he thought of her. He'd fallen for her big time, her and her sweet kids. They and Jaden had become the family he'd always wanted but never had. Amelia had been helping him out the last month by dropping hints to Rae that it was time for her to start dating again. It was Dylan's job to get her to see him as something more than just a best friend. So far, he hadn't been able to bring up the subject. Every time he tried, his brain and mouth had refused to work together. He was about to step into the main office where her desk was when he heard a second voice, a man's voice. Dylan peeked his head around just enough to catch a glimpse of the guy before pulling back. Jason Lee. Why was he in there? Rae didn't do the books for his route. Dylan frowned, edging closer so he could hear. Come on, Rae. You need to do something for yourself for once, Jason was saying in that flirty tone he used with all the females on the staff, even Amelia, who could have been his mother. I don't know. It hasn't been a year yet. What's magical about a year anyway? You just need to get out and have a good time for a change. Feel like a woman again. And Jason thought he was going to make her feel that way? The edge of Dylan's vision went red. The guy was a player, and probably thought that since she was a widow and hadn't been with a man for months, that she'd be easy prey. Hold your horses, Amelia whispered from behind Dylan as she grabbed his arm. Only then did he realize he'd taken a step forward, his fists clenched. He let her pull him away from the door. Did you hear that? He hissed. Yes, and it's not unexpected. He's been asking questions about her for a couple of weeks. And you didn't say anything to me? Dylan didn't try to shake the feeling of betrayal. Don't look at me like that. Amelia shook a motherly finger at him, almost hitting his nose with it. I'm on your side, remember? But you're going to have to tread lightly here unless you're willing to risk what you already have with her. You're right, Dylan let out his breath. She was always right. He wanted more from Rae, but he couldn't risk their friendship either. Amelia loved Rae too and wouldn't let anyone take advantage of her vulnerability. And she was vulnerable. Did Rae know that? She was so focused on her children that he and Amelia often had to remind her to do things for herself. Had they set her up for vultures like Jason? What am I going to do? Dylan asked. How can I protect her? She's a grown woman, so don't you get into the rescue mentality. She needs a partner, not someone who thinks she's stupid and can't figure things out for herself. But, no. What we need is to provide her with choices. And a little sabotage when necessary. Amelia now wore a wicked grin. What are you thinking, you devious woman? She's been taking you for granted, Dylan. You've been such a great friend to her that she's put you in the friend zone. He groaned. That was exactly where he was, but he had no idea how to get out of it. The first thing we'll need to do is help her go out on a bunch of lousy dates, Amelia said sagely. It'll demonstrate just how good the two of you are together. What about the sabotage thing? Well, don't you want to sabotage any date she has with Jason? Amelia gave him a sly wink. Why, yes. Yes, I do, Dylan grinned.
Thank you for listening to The Gift of a Child. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to know when new audiobooks or other fun videos are available.
This has been The Gift of a Child, written by Donna K. Weaver, narrated by Sandra Parker. Copyright 2018 by Donna K. Weaver. Production copyright by Donna K. Weaver.